There's no question some of the most popular Christmas characters are the wise men. The account of Jesus' birth from Matthew chapter 2 introduces us to a band of travelers that have mystified and intrigued us for centuries. It's fascinating how all of a sudden some wise men just materialize from out of nowhere. These fascinating gentlemen just show up, drop off some gifts, and then vanish into thin air. Or so it seems that's what happened. Question, who are these bizarre and exotic men? Are there three of them? Are these men actual ancient kings? Are these men riding on camels? And why are these non-Jewish men searching for a Jewish Messiah? These are just some of the questions we're going to answer this morning. The word translated as wise men in the original Greek language is the word magi. Magi. The word magi has been transliterated, not translated, transliterated means to be respelled. This Greek word magi has been respelled into our language as magi. So these wise men are called the magi. From a biblical perspective, these magi can be traced to the ancient Babylonian Empire. According to the book of Daniel, the magi served the ancient Babylonian ruler Nebuchadnezzar. The original magi assisted Nebuchadnezzar as priests for an ancient religion called Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism primarily functioned as an occultic religious practice. The ancient Zoroastrian priests were called magi and practiced all sorts of occultic phenomena, from sorcery to witchcraft. The word magic is also derived from this word magi or magi. So magi, magic, and magician are all related words. The question is, why are these magi called wise men? The answer is because these were wise men. These gentlemen were intelligent, highly educated, and trained in a number of professions. For instance, in addition to serving as Zoroastrian priests, magi doubled as scientists, mathematicians, architects, philosophers, doctors, and even legal authorities. As an example, our word magistrate refers to someone enforcing the law as a judge. He is a magistrate. Magistrate is another direct derivative from this ancient word magi and magi. One of the problems at Christmas time is that some of the accounts of Jesus' birth have been reduced to elaborate fables. Singers and storytellers have embellished the Christmas legend to where the average person doesn't know which details are authentic and which ones have been fabricated. Let me mention some biblical and historical inaccuracies. One, there was no evidence from either a biblical or historical perspective that there were just three magi. There was no evidence from either a biblical or historical perspective that there were just three magi. We sometimes sing the Christmas carol, "We Three Kings of Orient Are." And we should continue singing, "We Three Kings of Orient Are." I'm not another Scroogey, so I'm not banning Christmas carols. But that song does contain some biblical and historical inaccuracies. We three kings of Orient are. But we don't know that. Why do we believe there were three magi? The reason is because the number of magi is thought to correspond to the number of gifts that those magi brought to Jesus. Those magi brought three gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The logic is there was one gift per magi. So three gifts translates into three magi. But that's not necessarily the case, because magi often traveled in large groups. There might have been three magi. There could have been 13 magi. No one knows the exact number of magi that came to see Jesus. Second is that for more than 6 centuries, although different cultures and global empires Magi assisted different kings, but Magi were not kings themselves. Throughout those centuries, through different cultures and global empires, Magi assisted different kings, but Magi were not kings themselves. In some ancient societies, Magi actually assisted in selecting different kings and sometimes crowned the king, but Magi weren't kings because these men were primarily Zoroastrian priests. Number 3, there was no available information to document these Magi were Oriental. There is no available historical and or biblical information to document these Magi were Oriental. Now, the designation Orient was a geographic descriptor, and Orient meant countries east of Europe. Now, according to the modern political correctness police, that word Orient is now considered offensive, and we are told we shouldn't use that word. We can call a rug Oriental, but not a person. The problem is political correctness has caused is that it has created a hypersensitive society. Everyone is being offended. We need to lighten up, especially during Christmas time. The problem is we take ourselves too seriously and we don't take God seriously enough. Matthew said these wise men from the east. The question is, just where in the east were these wise men from? From East Asia? From East India? From East LA? Okay, probably not. No one knows. No one knows. Some historians believe these men were from the Parthian Empire, located northeast of Palestine or Israel, in a region where Iran is now. The point is, there are all kinds of fable and folklore out there about these ancient magi. The most important question is this: how would these ancient, non-Jewish, Gentile, Zoroastrian priests have known about a promised Jewish Messiah being born in Palestine? On the surface, that doesn't make sense. These priests had been part of a pagan and superstitious religious system, so how was it that they would be searching for the Jewish Messiah? The amazing part is that most Jewish scholars at this time weren't even aware Messiah had been born. So how did these non-Jewish men find out about this? How did it happen? Let me mention a distinct possibility. Historical evidence indicates that some magi were converted to Judaism during the period of the Babylonian captivity, meaning these magi became Jewish proselytes. Proselytes are converts. These magi converted to Judaism during the period of the Babylonian captivity. Let me explain. Remember this date, 931 BC, 9 centuries before Jesus. It was in 931 BC that the nation of Israel was divided into 2 separate kingdoms. Not unlike this nation was divided between the northern states and the southern states during the U.S. Civil War. There were 12 original tribes in ancient Israel. As a united nation, the nation consisted of 12 tribes. After the division in 931 BC, 10 of those tribes formed a northern kingdom that continued to be called Israel. And 2 of the smaller tribes formed a southern kingdom called Judah. So there was Israel in the north, consisting of 10 tribes, and Judah in the south, consisting of 2 tribes. Now, the Babylonian captivity describes the time period where Babylonian armies invaded the southern kingdom of Judah, captured some of the Jewish inhabitants, and brought them back to Babylon. The Babylonian captivity essentially occurred in 3 separate stages. The first stage was in 606 BC when Nebuchadnezzar captured individuals such as Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those 4 men, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, served right beside the Magi in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Remember, Daniel interpreted dreams. Those magi were unable to interpret, and because of that, he was actually placed in charge of Nebuchadnezzar's magi. So Daniel and his three devout Jewish friends started influencing the magi in the teachings of ancient Judaism. There's no question the different teachings and prophecies from the ancient Jewish scriptures started infiltrating the Magi's belief system. That's the reason some of these Magi converted to Judaism. From these Jewish associations, Daniel and his friends, these Magi's were made conscious of a promised Messiah. And this messianic awareness continued to increase among the Magi throughout the centuries until these specific Magi mentioned here in Matthew put together some Old Testament messianic prophetical passages and started a serious search to find this messianic child, Jesus. I believe there's something else to consider. Remember, Magi were Zoroastrian priests, and Zoroastrianism emphasized a combination of astronomy and astrology. Astronomy and astrology. And the Magi often confused them. Zoroastrianism was part ancient science and part astrological superstition. And there is a difference. Astronomy is a legitimate science, and astrology is a pseudoscience, meaning astrology is a false science. Probably the most common astrological practice is reading horoscopes. Horoscopes have absolutely no scientific basis to them. And Christians have no business consulting horoscopes because astrology is actually considered an occultic practice. The problem is the Magi sometimes confused astronomy, a legitimate science, and astrology, and practiced them both. Because of this extensive background in astronomical science and even astrological superstition, it is easy to see how these Magi were extremely susceptible to astronomical phenomena. That's the reason God used a star to direct them to where Messiah could be found. In fact, each Christmas, planetariums and astronomers attempt to explain the Christmas star. Some feel that star might have been the planet Jupiter. Some feel it could have been some unidentifiable comet, or it could have been some sort of a conjunction or an alignment of two unknown planets, or possibly an exploding new star called a supernova, or some other explainable phenomena. I don't accept those explanations. The reason I don't is because this star directed these Magi to the specific house where Jesus was at that precise moment. This star acted as a GPS and pinpointed the precise geographical location, the actual house, the actual spot where Jesus was. And that's something an ordinary star or even a superordinary star would not have been able to do. Let's start at verse 9. When they heard the king, they departed. And behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. Verse 10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. Now this might be conjecture, but I believe this star could have been some form of God's Shekinah glory. In Scripture and in the Old Testament in particular, God sometimes manifested part of his actual presence to man in the form of a bright, multicolored light. A bright, multicolored light. And this cloud of light was called his Shekinah. In the Old Testament, God actually used this Shekinah as a navigational aid. In Exodus, remember, God showed Moses how to navigate through the desert using a pillar of cloud in the daylight hours and then a pillar of fire at night. Both phenomena were probably manifestations of his Shekinah presence. To be honest, no one knows for sure what this star was. It might have been God manifesting some of his Shekinah presence in some form of a unique and unusual star. No one knows. Somehow, though, this star signified to these magi that Jesus had been born, and it then showed them exactly where he was. It seems as though it descended from heaven and landed virtually right on top of this house. And that's amazing. There's another interesting misconception. The Magi did not visit Jesus the night of his birth. The Magi weren't there the night of his actual birth. We don't know the exact location of Jesus' birth, other than he was born in Bethlehem. But we do know soon after his birth, probably just minutes after he was born, the child Jesus, Yeshua, was placed into a manger. A manger is a trough used for feeding animals. And because animals were fed in troughs found in and around stables, this is how we got the idea that the child was born in a stable, which according to tradition was probably a cave. But notice these magi did not visit the child in a stable, but according to verse 11, the magi found Jesus in a house. What does that mean? That means the traditional nativity scene is inaccurate, because the wise men weren't there. All nativity scenes have the wise men, but from a historical perspective, biblical perspective, the wise men weren't there. I can understand the practical reason of putting the wise men there, because we can't create two different nativity scenes. One scene with a messianic child, his parents Mary and Joseph in a stable, and then another scene as an older infant in a house. And no one wants to eliminate the wise men, so we just put them all together. And that's okay. And the reason that's okay is some benign artistic license is acceptable. So it's not something to get upset about. But in a technical, historical sense, the wise men did not visit Jesus in the manger. Verse 11, and when they had come into the house, not in a stable, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother. Jesus and his mother Mary are described as being in a house. So the Magi found Jesus in a house. And that might have happened weeks, months, or even as long as 2 years after Jesus was born. Let me demonstrate how there might have been a sizable time gap between Jesus' birth and the moment when those Magi found him in a house. Verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Verse 2, saying, where is he who has been born? Notice, past tense. Where is he who has been born, King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. These magi came to Herod's palace and said to him, where is the promised Messiah? Remember, the Old Testament Hebrew word Messiah and the New Testament Greek word Christ are the same thing. Both words mean the anointed ruler from God. The Messiah would be the one special person God had chosen to anoint as the ultimate ruler and king of the Jewish people. Now notice the wise men asked the question, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Meaning these magi wanted Herod to tell them, where was this promised Messiah? Where was this special anointed ruler from God? Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Herod felt politically threatened. At the birth announcement of this Messiah, he mistakenly felt a Messiah could be competition for him and would want his position. Matthew said Herod was, after hearing this, was troubled about this, and he used a word in the original language that meant shaken or agitated, similar to the heavy-duty cycle of a washing machine. Meaning Herod was all shook up. He regained his composure, though, and decided to be a diplomat. Notice what he did next. Verse 4. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ, meaning where the Messiah, was to be born. So Herod pulled together this religious brain trust consisting of scribes and Pharisees and said to them, "Where is this Messiah? Exactly where is it that he was predicted to be born?" Verse 5. So they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea. For thus it is written by the prophet," that was the prophet Micah. Verse 6, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Remember at the beginning of this passage, the Magi just showed up in Palestine and started asking around for this Messiah, this Messianic child, and no one seemed to know where the Messiah would be born. Herod didn't know, so he asked these, quote, Jewish scholars where Messiah might be born. These men then searched the Old Testament scriptures and found this messianic passage from Micah 5, verse 2, that is mentioned in verse 6. Centuries before this, the prophet Micah had prophesied Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Verse 7, "Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared." Verse 8. "And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the young child. And when you have found him, bring back word to me.'" Notice, "Bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also." Right. Herod wanted to worship the Messiah. I don't think so. Herod had an ulterior, evil motive for finding Messiah. His motive for finding this Messiah, this Messianic child, was to eliminate his potential competition. He wanted to murder the Messiah. He called a secret meeting, pulled the Magi in, and said to them, "Gentlemen, find this Messianic child. Bring me back the information that I need to go where he is so I can worship him myself." That was a complete and utter falsehood. That was a lie. In fact, after these Magi found the Messianic child, an angel, through the means of a dream, exposed Herod's evil scheme and instructed Jesus' parents to go home through another route so to avoid Herod altogether. Verse 16. "Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry. And he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men." It is probable that some months had passed after the Magi had first met Herod, and this time lapse caused Herod to suspect the Magi probably weren't going to be coming back and giving him the location of the Messianic child, as he had asked them to. He realized these men were avoiding him on purpose. He didn't know where this Messiah was, and he was so upset and so determined to eliminate his perceived potential competition that he gave the decree, don't miss this, he gave the decree to execute all male children from in and around Bethlehem in order to assure the death of this Messianic child. That was an unbelievable atrocity. He actually issued a decree to murder all male children aged 2 and under from in and around this region so as to ensure the death of this Messianic child. That's called infanticide, and it is a gross evil. The point is that Herod had determined the age of the children to be murdered from the time when he first spoke to the Magi. So it might have been up to almost 2 years after Jesus was born before the Magi actually found him. And that means the wise men did not see Jesus in a manger. Verse 11, "And when they had opened their treasures, they presented to him gold, frankincense, and myrrh." The first gift was gold. Gold was the most expensive of these gifts. Ancient rulers and kings wore gold as a part of their attire. Joseph was vice regent next to Pharaoh in Egypt, and he wore a gold neck chain. Daniel was also given a gold chain as the third ruler in ancient Babylon. These ancient rulers also held scepters made out of gold. So in these magi giving Jesus gold, these men substantiated the fact Jesus, as the promised Messiah, had been born to become a king. The second gift was frankincense. In the original language, this word frankincense meant pure incense. That incense came from a white juice that was extracted from the bark of a certain tree found in Arabia. In the Old Testament, frankincense was actually stored in front of the temple in a container. It was added to an animal sacrifice in order to create a flavor and an aroma that would, in a symbolic sense, float up from the sacrifice to heaven and to God himself. According to Deuteronomy 30, frankincense was an incense primarily for God's enjoyment. So in giving this gift of frankincense, these magi demonstrated that Jesus is God and deserves our sacrifice. The third gift is myrrh. Myrrh was a perfume that was extracted from a small tree also located in Arabia. Myrrh was used in Proverbs 7, verse 17 to perfume a bed. Myrrh was used in Psalm 45, verse 8 to put on clothes because myrrh was a prototype to modern deodorants. Myrrh and wine would also sometimes be combined together to form an anesthetic, a narcotic, a painkiller. That combination of myrrh and wine was given to Jesus on the cross to numb his pain. But remember, he rejected it. Then the most often use of myrrh was to embalm dead bodies. In fact, myrrh was used to prepare the body of Jesus to be buried. In giving Jesus, this messianic child, myrrh, these magi were, in a prophetic symbolic sense, demonstrated that Jesus, the man, was scheduled to die. So these are the three gifts. Gold symbolizing the fact Jesus would be a king, frankincense symbolizing his divine nature, and then myrrh predicting his sacrificial death. The situation is, these magi brought these three precious gifts and managed to find the star located right above the house where Jesus was. And then what exactly did these magi do after finding Jesus? Verse 11, and when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, notice, and fell down and worshiped him. One of the most common words used in evangelical nomenclature is the designation seeker. Seeker. Some churches consider themselves to be seeker-driven, seeker-centered. We are considered to be more seeker-sensitive, meaning we are sensitive to the needs of non-Christian people attending our services, seeking God. And I don't believe we can seek God apart from God. These magi were the original seekers. And so notice three things about these men and about spiritual seeking. One is these men wanted to find the truth about Jesus, the Messiah. There's a significant difference between a seeker and a spectator. Spiritual spectators might see God in action, but then create their own premature and often erroneous conclusions as to what God is about. But seekers aren't into superficial conjecture and guesses. Seekers, genuine seekers, are determined to seek and seek and seek and search and search and search and do whatever it takes to find the unadulterated truth. It is ironic to me that at the time Jesus was born, the most prestigious religious center on earth was located just 6 miles from his birthplace. The biggest concentration of religious academia at that time was concentrated in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was located just 6 miles from Bethlehem. But notice that not one Jerusalem religious personality traveled those 6 miles in order to find the truth. The problem is some people insist that they want to find truth, but then don't take the time and make the effort to find it. I tell someone I have some books that specifically address the questions seekers ask. And sometimes the response is, but I don't have time to read. And then I tell them that's okay because I have those same books on CD. And the response is, I don't listen to books. I only listen to music. It's just incredible to me that some people are too busy to find the answers to life's most important questions. Remember, all Christians ultimately started out as seekers. Seekers wanting to find the truth. Second is these men accepted the evidence that was available to them. These men accepted the evidence that was available to them. Salvation doesn't start at man. Salvation starts at God. And because God wants us to find Him, He gives us evidence to help us do that. In the case of these wise men, the evidence available to them were the Old Testament messianic prophecies and this special star. It's interesting, we don't have any indication from Scripture that anyone else was able to see the star. There's no evidence that Herod had seen the star or that anyone else at Jerusalem had seen the star. The only people, to our knowledge, that were actually able to see that star were these magi, these wise men. It was a special, custom-made, designed star from God, created as a sign or evidence to enable the magi to find Jesus. Those magi accepted that evidence, and that evidence ultimately brought them to Jesus. The evidence that is available to us now might be the Scriptures themselves, and often is, or an apologist books, or an online sermon, or a gospel tract, or a 12-step Christian recovery program, or someone close to us that shares how Jesus radically changed them from the inside out. But if we accept the evidence we do have, then God will give us more evidence and more evidence until, if we're cooperative, that evidence brings us to Jesus. The exciting part is at the same time we are seeking to find God, God is seeking us out because He wants us to have a meaningful relationship with Him and with His Son Jesus. And once that happens, that relationship does three basic things for us. One, Jesus gives us complete and irreversible forgiveness. Forgiveness from past, present, and even future sins in a judicial sense. Second, Jesus gives us a life purpose. There is now meaning to our existence on this earth. And third, Jesus gives us a guarantee of heaven. People, there is no better Christmas present than that. Number three, these men ultimately both recognized and received the truth. These men recognized and received the truth. These magi recognized that this was a special child. And this child was special because he was more than human. He was also God. This account that describes the Magi's response to Jesus records a definitive statement on the identification of Jesus Christ. And most people miss this. In Revelation chapter 19, John the Apostle started to worship a personality from heaven. This was probably an angel. And this person or angel emphatically rejected John's worship. Notice Revelation 19, verse 10. And I, John, fell at his feet to worship him. John fell on his face at the feet of this celestial personage, and he started to worship this anonymous being. But he, this person, said to me, "See that you do not do that. I am your fellow servant and of your brethren who have had the testimony of Jesus. Worship God." Notice the explanation point used to emphasize the fact we are to worship only God. John was commanded to worship God and only God. And since this person he sees wasn't God, he didn't deserve or want to be worshiped. I want us to logically think through this argument. If God and God alone is to be worshiped, and no one else beside God is to be worshipped, and these magi, after finding this messianic child, are falling on the ground and worshiping Jesus, then the logical and only conclusion is that Jesus, the promised Messiah, has to be God. God alone is to be worshipped. These magi are worshiping Jesus. Therefore, Jesus, the messianic child, has to be God. He had to be God so he could become a sinless man. And he had to be a sinless man so he could be qualified to be punished on the cross for the sins of the human race. And he had to do that so he could become the Savior. Some say he was just a good teacher. The good teachers don't claim to be God. Some say he was merely a good example. But good examples don't mingle with prostitutes and sinners. Some say he was a madman. But madmen don't speak the way he spoke. Some say he was a crazed fanatic. But crazed fanatics don't draw children to themselves, and neither do they attract men of intellect like Paul or Luke to be their followers. Some say he was a religious phony. But phonies don't come back from the dead. Some say he was only a phantom, a figment of someone's imagination. But phantoms can't give their flesh and blood to be crucified on a cross. Some say he was only a myth. But myths don't set the calendar for history. Jesus has been called the ideal man, an example of love, the highest model of religion, the foremost pattern of virtue, the greatest of all men, and the finest teacher who has ever lived. And all these descriptions capture some elements of his character, but they all fall short of the full truth. The Apostle Thomas expressed it perfectly when he saw Jesus after the resurrection, and he said, "My Lord and my God." That is Jesus. Jesus is both God and man. He is both divine and human. He is the God-man, and as God, Jesus both deserves and demands our worship. So these magi fell on the ground prostrate before the Christ child and engaged in an act of worship to him. It is a logical conclusion, listen to this, a logical conclusion to assume that because the magi had started to worship Jesus, it meant those men were at that moment personally received him as the promised Messiah. I contend these magi were some of the earliest Gentile Christians because these men recognized the fact that the Old Testament prophetical scriptures were fulfilled in this Christ child and that he was and is the promised Messiah. And then after finding him, these men fell on the ground and as an act of worship received him into their lives. Probably most of us have seen the familiar Christmas slogan printed on countless cards and Christmas items. That slogan reads, "Wise men still seek him." Wise men still seek him. The fact is, wise men do still seek Jesus. There are two categories of people on earth, those that are foolish and those that are wise. Just where we fit into either category is contingent entirely on how we have reacted to Jesus Christ. If we reject him or neglect him, then we're foolish. If we seek him and find him and submit to him as Lord and receive him as the Messiah and as our personal Savior and forgiver, then we're wise. The choice is ours because wise men still seek him. Let's bow our heads.